Okay,
please.
So you can see, okay.
Thank you very much, please.
Thank you, Vasıf, not only for that introduction, but for inviting me to talk on this topic, which is not only your favorite topic, but also mine. My focus will be on the mid-3rd millennium and the so-called Philia phenomenon, but I will also look back briefly to the Chalcolithic and on to the rest of the early and middle Bronze Age. The Philia was a critical point of change in Cypriot prehistory, and it has long been a subject of debate and at times of quite significant dispute. As Christoph Bakuba has pointed out relatively recently, Anatolian archaeologists have been underrepresented in this discussion, which is why I particularly welcome the opportunity to contribute to this series of lectures, and I hope to receive your feedback. So starting with a brief background, and the way that the Philia has developed as an archaeological construct is probably a little bit confusing to anyone who's not familiar with Cypriot prehistory. So I think a little bit of backstory might be helpful. In the late 1950s, when the Australian archaeologist James Stewart set out to write his account of the Cypriot early Bronze Age for Swedish Cyprus Expedition Volume 4.1a, which went on to become, as it were, the Bible, and the Cypriot archaeologist Porphyrios Dikios set out to write his account of the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods for the same volume. From the beginning, there was an issue concerning the transition from the Chalcolithic to the early Bronze Age, because Stewart and Dikios had very different views on the chronology and significance of a particular entity which had already become known as the Philia culture. So what are we talking about? What are we talking about when we talk about the Philia culture? Dikios excavated 6 tombs near the modern villages of Philia and Kira in the Ofgos Valley in the northern part of Cyprus in 1942 and 1951. These tombs produced pottery which was quite different to the pottery which had been excavated by Stewart at Vounus, very well-known site on the north coast, only a few years earlier in 1937, which was considered to date to the beginning of the early Bronze Age and classed as early Cypriot 1 to 2. Dikios identified his material as belonging to a new cultural entity, which he called the Philia, after the nearest village. A few years later, in 1955, Stewart excavated some pit tombs at Aya Paraskevi, which is modern Nicosia, and several very impressive chamber tombs with long plastered dromoi, carved entrances and buttressed chambers at Vasilia on the north coast, which produced similar material to the material that Dikios had found at Philia and Kira. The question was, how did this new material fit into what was considered on the basis of the previous work at Vounus to be the early Bronze Age cultural sequence of the island? Dikios believed that the Philia culture stood at the very beginning of the early Bronze Age, predating the tombs at Vounus. Stewart believed that it was contemporary with Vounus. So Swedish Cyprus Expedition Volume 4.1a appeared in 1962 with the Philia identified by Dikios in his section of the volume as ancestral to mainstream early Bronze Age culture and a development of external origin likely to be a result of population movement from Anatolia, and by Stewart in his section of the volume as a regional variant of the early Bronze Age, restricted to the northwest and centre of the island with an indigenous past and no future. Sorry, I've just got out of sync there. Sorry. So for Stewart, it was a regional phenomenon that was contemporary with the mainstream early Bronze Age, an isolated phenomenon with an indigenous past and no future. He rejected the idea of an Anatolian origin, arguing that both the Philia and the mainstream early Bronze Age cultures were derived from the local Chalcolithic and products of what he referred to as the genius of the islanders. And that was where things stood until the 1990s, when excavations by David Frankel and myself at the settlement of Marquis in the central lowlands provided the first stratigraphic sequence through the early into the middle Bronze Age. We identified 9 architectural phases, the earliest, phases A and B, which were deeply buried and not very well preserved, produced Philia material similar to that which had been found at Vasilia, Philia and Aya Paraskevi. And the next 2 phases, C and D, produced material similar to that from the earliest tombs at Vounus. material of what had already come to be called early Cypriot 1 to 2. And subsequent phases produced material of early Cypriot 3, middle Cypriot 1, and so on. The stratigraphy at Marquis, in other words, showed beyond doubt that Philia cultural material is earlier than the EC 1 to 3 sequence. So Decius was correct in identifying it as the initial phase of the early Bronze Age in Cyprus. This caused some confusion in terms of the terminology because we already had an early Cypriot 1, so the Philia is usually referred to as the Philia early Cypriot. Stewart was also mistaken about the Philia being geographically restricted. We now have evidence for a Philia presence also in the south and west of the island. At this point, however, only Marquis, which was founded in the Philia period, and Kisoniga on the southwest coast, which was a Neolithic and Chalcolithic settlement which continued into the Philia and beyond, only these two sites have significant excavated and published Philia settlement deposits. So it's important to note at this early stage that the database we have for the Philia, particularly in terms of settlement material, is significantly limited. There can also be little doubt of the significance of the Philia horizon. The early Bronze Age in Cyprus is marked by a series of innovations which signal a major shift from the Chalcolithic. These appear during the Philia and involve pretty well every aspect of life. Our excavations at Marquis reopened debate about the origin of these innovations and the way in which they arrived or developed in Cyprus. And talking about these, it may be useful to separate issues of origin and issues of process and deal with them separately, and then come back to bring them together at the end. But firstly, what can we say about where these innovations may have come from, based on similarities in artifact form and cultural practice? Firstly, ceramics. The main Philia fabric is red polished Philia ware. It is fine, calcareous, and relatively soft fired with a lustrous red surface. There are clear generic similarities with Anatolian vessel forms, jugs with flat bases, ovoid bodies, and high cutaway mouths being the most obvious example. There are new techniques of manufacture, including the use of disc bases and push-through or rod handles, with parallels at Tarsus, for example, and I show you one example here, and new types of surface treatment, including white-filled incised motifs, which have been compared with those on local fabrics from Silicia, especially Tarsus, notably parallel chevrons, herringbones without central lines, and so on. Subvarieties of red polished ware include differentially fired vessels and vessels with irregular or pattern burnishing. There is a coarser fabric with a matte red slip, Philia red slipware, which was used for a range of domestic and industrial vessels. And two less common fabrics, plain Philia white painted and black slip and combed ware, also occur across the island. The ceramic connections with Anatolia are too broad to identify specific prototypes, but in terms of timing, what is missing is very significant. We do not have wheel-made vessels or tankards, depus cups, platters, or imitation Syrian bottles, which are typical of EB3 assemblages across Anatolia. So these ceramic influences or innovations must have reached Cyprus during EB2 prior to the ceramic changes of EB3. That is before the third quarter of the third millennium. The Philia horizon also produced the first direct fire boiling vessels known in Cyprus. Philia cooking pots from Marquis show the use of specific fabrics for two vessel types, type A and type B. Other new vessel forms associated with cooking and heating include baking pans and braziers or portable hearths with punctured and matte impressed bases. These begin in the Philia at Marquis and continue through the early and middle Bronze Age. Above ground ovens also appear for the first time in Philia levels at Marquis, and new hearth types. Related to the new hearth types are horseshoe-shaped hearth surrounds, which we call hobs. In the Anatolian context, I think they're more often referred to as andirons. There's one fragmentary example from a Philia context, and numerous complete and fragmentary examples, both built-in and portable, and frequently decorated from all subsequent phases of occupation. Each of these artifact types has earlier and contemporary parallels in Western and Central Anatolia and Cilicia. Andirons, of course, are associated with earlier Transcaucasian and Khörbet-Karak sites, but by the mid-3rd millennium occur across much of Anatolia and the Levant. Philia deposits have also produced the earliest evidence from Cyprus for loom weights, or at least for clay loom weights, and shaped terracotta spindle whorls, which are biconical like EB2 Anatolian whorls, suggesting the presence of new textile technologies, including the vertical loom. Bronze Age Cypriot spinners appear to have practiced a middle or low whirl spinning technology. David and I have argued this, and of course, Lindy Crew has also in greater detail. That is, we have argued that they used spindles on which the whirl was mounted below the middle or at the base of the shaft. There are a number of strands of evidence for this. There is a consistent pattern of abrasion on the lower terminal of most whirls, perhaps from contact with the ground during drop spinning with a low whirl spindle, or from the use of wedging material in the lower terminal. And I've just shown you this particular whirl so that you can note the hooked swastika motif, which is also arguably a connection with Anatolia. And this clay spindle whirl from Vunus has a hole in what must be the top to attach the thread. Sorry, this is a spindle model, which has a hole at the top, which must indicate whether the thread or a hook was attached, and the whirl clearly shown at the bottom. And these two metal spindles have spiral thread grooves at the top, and in one case, a whirl still in position below the midpoint. These objects date later in the early Bronze Age, or in the case of the metal spindles in the Middle Bronze Age, but the new textile technology is likely to arrive at the beginning of the period as a package: so shaped whirls, low whirl spindles, and the vertical loom. Elizabeth Barber has identified 4 zones of textile development in Europe and the Levant prior to 2000 BC. Across Anatolia and Europe, the vertical warp-weighted loom and low whirl spindles were used, and in Egypt and the Levant, the horizontal ground loom and high whirl spindles. The technology of Cypriot Bronze Age textile production belongs in the northwestern zone and must presumably have been introduced from this region. Cattle, donkeys, and screw-horned goats were not present in Cyprus in the Chalcolithic, but appear in the Philia faunal record at Marquis. They can only have arrived by boat in sufficient numbers to establish viable populations. The pattern of animal exploitation at Marquis is radically different to the late Chalcolithic Kisoniga, Kisoniga and Lemba, which is a site near Kisoniga, where deer and pig constitute almost 80% of the bone sample. In Philia levels at Marquis, deer and pig comprise only 10% of animal bone, while cattle are present at 24%, and reliance on caprines, and particularly sheep, is 3 times higher at 62%. Now, I realize that it would be much better if we could compare the faunal record at Marquis with late Chalcolithic, with the record of a late Chalcolithic site in the same region, but we don't have that luxury. So I can only compare it with the late Chalcolithic faunal record from sites quite a long way away in the southwest. A new form of back sickle blade is also found in Philia levels at Marquis, and a similar situation exists with regard to some elements of the bone tool industry. Flat sectioned rib bone points, for example, are not known in Chalcolithic Cyprus, but present at Marquis and widely distributed across mainland Western Asia. The solard, or single-handed plough, which is depicted in later early Bronze Age Cypriot iconography, notably on this very famous ploughing model from Vunus, almost certainly arrived also in the Philia, replacing hoe-based agriculture. Paul Croft has suggested that the robustness of the first phalange of some oxen in Philia levels at Marquis may reflect their use as draft animals. Evidence for plough agriculture from the beginning of the early Bronze Age may also be visible in the spread of settlement into agriculturally marginal areas like Marquis, and a dramatic increase in cereal grinding equipment is also reflected in the groundstone assemblage at Marquis, where rubbers and querns are far more common than they are in late Chalcolithic levels at Kisoniga and Lemba. Solard ploughs are believed to have been in use at this time in Anatolia and the Aegean, and two-handled ploughs in the Levant and Egypt. So again, an Anatolian origin is most likely. Small annular pendants in stone, bone, shell, and copper are one of the diagnostic markers of the Philia facies. They recall the ring-shaped pendants, often referred to as idols, from Anatolia and the Balkans, which date to the 4th millennium, but which continued in use in Western and Central Anatolia until the second half of the 3rd millennium. Rania Kulka has suggested that the Cypriot pendants are an adaptation of an Anatolian type brought to Cyprus by metal workers who, quote, wished to preserve their personal symbolism abroad. Eddie Peltenberg has noted similar pendants from northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. Now, there is an issue here around the timing. There are shell examples which come from late Chalcolithic deposits at Kisoniga. So this type of ornament may well have been adopted in Cyprus prior to the Philia. Whatever the case, if they are derived from an Anatolian type, it seems to me at least that something was lost in translation because ours are upside down. You see that the perforation, which was used to suspend them as pendants or earrings, is, in the case of the Cypriot examples, in the ring opposite the spur, whereas in the Anatolian examples, the hole is in the actual spur. So they were suspended in a way that makes them look much more anthropomorphic. So there's something to be explained here. I just pointed out at this point. The Philia metal assemblage includes spearheads, daggers, axes, chisels, awls, needles, razors, earrings, pendants, and toggle pins. With the exception of the chisel and axe, these are all new to Cyprus and closely related to Anatolian types. At Marquis, metal was used for basic tasks from the beginning. We have, for example, many metal needles, and it's likely that Marquis was founded in the Philia period, specifically to process copper from the nearby ore bodies. This stone mold, which was found reused in one of the earliest walls, suggests metalworking at a substantial scale during the Philia, likely for off-site distribution. It was used to cast axes of over 1 kilo in weight, similar to examples in the Philia metal assemblage, and similar to axes, for example, from the Soli hoard from Silicia. If we step back for a moment and look at the evidence for metalworking in the preceding Chalcolithic, there are some controversial issues and new developments. To date, there are, I think I'm right in saying, only 21 metal artifacts known from the whole of the Middle and Late Chalcolithic in Cyprus, amounting to less than 1 kilo of metal in total. Most are small ornaments of hammered and annealed copper, but there are several Late Chalcolithic chisels which must have been mold cast. There are 2 possible crucibles from Late Chalcolithic Kisoniga, which may provide evidence for the small scale or possibly experimental smelting of local ores, but 3 of the larger Late Chalcolithic artifacts contain tin, which is not present in Cypriot copper. The issue of when transformative copperworking technologies first appear in Cyprus has been a problem since the publication in 2003 of the lead isotope composition of an axe dating to the early 3rd millennium from Pella in Jordan, which is said to be consistent with copper from a Cypriot ore body. This has been a problem because we have no evidence to suggest that Cypriot ores were being mined, let alone smelted and exported at this time. And we're talking about the Middle Chalcolithic. More recently, a metal axe, which is of morphologically of a type that would be at home in both Anatolia and the Aegean, was found at Chlorakas, a site which is currently being excavated in southwest Cyprus, in a deposit dated to about 2600 BC, so well into the Late Chalcolithic. It contains a very small amount of tin. Lead isotope analyses of this axe and 2 other objects, which have been compared recently with the lead isotope composition of the Pella axe. The results, published recently by Düring and his colleagues, suggest that the Chlorakas objects and the Pella axe match only Anatolian ores, and that a Cypriot origin for the copper in these items can be excluded. They also argue that the few Late Chalcolithic metal objects from Cyprus produced with smelting and casting techniques were made from imported metal or imported as finished artifacts. This means that, at least for now, and I suspect this will continue to be an issue, but at least for now, we can continue to argue that transformative copper technologies were not used in Cyprus until the Philia phase, and that metallurgical technologies introduced at this time included the mining and smelting of sulfide ores and the production of mold cast artifacts of clearly Anatolian types. The Philia horizon also saw the replacement of the monocellular roundhouses, which had been in use in Cyprus for 8,000 years, with rectilinear structures built of mold-made mud bricks on stone footings, such as those we found in phases A and B at Marquis. And changes in burial practice, from predominantly intramural pit burial in the late Chalcolithic to a collective burial system in extramural cemeteries. There are some intramural infant burials in pithoi, which may well relate to Anatolian practices. A 2-year-old child in a pithos placed upright below a courtyard at Marquis, and 2 from Philia phase occupation at Chisoniga, in this case placed horizontally or obliquely in tight-fitting pits. Pithoi found in tombs at Vasilia and Philia may also have contained skeletal material, but we do not have any examples of the extramural standalone pithos burials or stone-lined cyst tombs which occur across Anatolia. The most common burial type in the Philia is a simple inhumation in a circular or oval pit. Simple inhumations are also common in Anatolia. There are also relatively simple rock-cut chamber tombs at Philia in particular, and at least 4 of the much larger and more complex chamber tombs at Vasilia. So there are significant unresolved questions here. If the other innovations point to a source in Anatolia, why do we have no Anatolian type extramural pithos or cyst tombs? And where did the idea of the chamber tomb come from? Chamber tombs do not occur in Anatolia in EB1 or EB2. Priscilla Keswani and Diane Bolger have pointed to a chamber tomb tradition in North Syria, which is roughly contemporary with its adoption in Cyprus, specifically at Titris Huyuk. And Rania Kuka suggests that the idea of a chamber tomb with a dromos reached Cyprus together with cycladic copper via Western Anatolia. There are, however, no Levantine or Aegean parallels that I'm aware of to the multi-chambered tombs with pillared facades at Vasilia. Moving on, we have evidence for new child-rearing practices. At Marquis, 3 of the 5 human skulls examined showed occipital flattening. This is likely to be a secondary effect of the use of cradle boards, which are depicted on somewhat later terracottas. There's no evidence for either intentional or accidental head shaping in the Chalcolithic, so this suggests, as Kirsi Lorenz has argued, a profound change in infant care practices. And finally, as identified by Yorgos Georgiou, the Philia saw the introduction to Cyprus of the tubular drill used in the Philia and in later periods to decorate stone and bone objects with concentric circles, and also to cut cylindrical beads in hard stones like jasper. In sum, our search for the origins of elements of the Philia material culture points primarily, but perhaps not exclusively, to Anatolia, but beyond this, the links are either frustratingly generic, missing altogether, or occur across a very wide area. I will come back to this. If we move now to process, what modes of transmission lie behind these innovations? Most people accept that Anatolia is broadly the source of the new practices, but thinking around how they reached Cyprus, polarized for some time around a model of internal restructuring on one hand and migration on the other. Specifically, the Philia was seen either as a result of internal processes stimulated by elite contact with Anatolia, so reflecting the movement of goods and ideas, but not of people. This was strongly argued by Bernard Knapp, and in essence was also Stewart's view. Or a result of the movement of people, as well as goods and ideas, from Anatolia to Cyprus. This was Decius's view, and it's one which David Frankel and I have also argued. I think I'm right in saying that things are somewhat less polarized now. Bernard Knapp's more recent publications accept the presence of at least some newcomers, and argue that the Philia are developed through hybridisation processes between indigenous and incoming populations. And David and I certainly accept that bidirectional processes, whatever we choose to call them, played a major role in the development of the early Bronze Age in Cyprus. The migration and hybridisation are, of course, not mutually exclusive processes. With respect to the issue of incoming groups, our view has been, and still is, that the only transmission process which can account for the breadth, complexity, and vertical depth of the innovations in Cypriot society is one which involved a significant movement of people, in fact, of whole communities. That the kind of technology transfer we see at this time can only have been achieved through the arrival of people practicing those technologies, not through occasional contact, trade, elite emulation, or what Eddie Peltenberg has referred to as the unlikely phenomenon of distance learning in prehistory. The Philia innovations don't involve only one or two components or an elite overlay, but an entire cultural inventory, materials and behaviours which constitute habitual practice at every level. Hobs, low-well spindles and cradle boards, for example, are not prestige items, not superior technologies, just culturally specific different ways of doing things. And none of these innovations is behaviourally or functionally isolated. They each belong to an interrelated set of material items and practices. Hobs are one element in a new set of food processing and consumption equipment, low-well spindles in a new set of textile equipment, backed sickle blades in a new agricultural package, and so on. We have a lot to learn about the arrival and spread of each of these innovations, but at this point, the process looks like relatively sudden rather than evolutionary change, involving multiple intrusive technologies. The domestic practices in particular belong to a cultural matrix which is unlikely to have taken hold without women as agents of social reproduction. Importantly also, we don't see a period of experimentation, as potters, for example, learned how to make cooking pots capable of withstanding thermal stress. David and I initially argued for a migration to Cyprus from Anatolia. More recently, we have identified this more specifically as a process of colonization. I realize all of these terms are loaded, but I'm basing my discussion on definitions that you see here from a work by Patrick Manning. So that is what we're now suggesting, is that it was a particular kind of migration involving the planned departure of people from one or more communities to establish new communities that replicate those at home. And this is an important distinction. We suggest that when people moved to Cyprus, they did not become members of existing communities, rather they established new independent autonomous settlements. We've also suggested that the move to Cyprus was based on explicit prior knowledge of the island and that it involved a transported landscape. That is, incoming groups brought with them resources that they knew were not available, like cattle and donkeys, and targeted those they knew were available. So why would people have moved to Cyprus at this time? Dikios and Catling, influenced by Mellart's argument for disruptions in Anatolia at the end of EB2, suggested that they were refugees from the mainland. Mellink, in one of few papers by someone working in Anatolia, proposed that they were prospectors and miners from Silicia who went to Cyprus as part of a broadly based search for new sources of metal. David and I have also proposed that copper provided the main incentive for a move to Cyprus. Bakhuba has recently questioned this, asking why people would have gone to Cyprus for copper when there are so many sources available in Anatolia, and suggesting instead that the move was prompted by population pressure and land degradation. But it need not have been directly related to the accessibility or inaccessibility of local ores. Entrepreneurial colonization episodes typically happen when commodity values are stable and very high. A desire to find new sources of metal for the Anatolian trade network provides just such a context for a move to Cyprus at this time. Access to external sources may have offered security against potential internal disruptions, and multiple sources of supply may have been especially important for metalworking centres like that at Tarsus. At this point, it's useful, I think, to remind ourselves how close the north coast of Cyprus is to the south coast of Anatolia. The minimum distance from coastline to coastline between Silifke and Anamur, which is where this picture was taken, is about 65 kilometres or 40 nautical miles. And for most of the year, from April to October, Cyprus is clearly visible and can be reached in one day's sail during daylight hours. Much of the Anatolian coastline between Antalya and Silicia is also characterized by steep cliffs, which likely offered few anchorages linked to accessible settlements, in which case Cyprus may have been what Stella Domestica has argued for later periods, a necessary stopover for ships travelling this east-west sea lane, leading to the early incorporation of the north-central coast of Cyprus into this maritime interaction sphere. And we have good evidence from Philia on the north coast that this site, at least, was involved in a maritime metals trade during the Philia. 13 Philia metal objects offered for sale in Nicosia in 1959 are likely to come from Philia, which was being looted at this time. A good number of these was bought by Jim Stewart and taken to Australia, and he certainly was of the view that they came from Philia. A number of others were acquired by the Cyprus Museum. They include a hook-tang spearhead, 2 tripartite spearheads, 5 axes, a chisel, 2 daggers, and 2 ring-shaped objects. The tripartite spearheads are unique in Cyprus, but broadly paralleled by examples from Silicia and North Syria. We have compositional and lead isotope analyses for 8 of these objects, including one of the tripartite spearheads and the hook-tang spearhead, both of which are tin bronzes, with copper consistent with a central torus source, and so on all counts, almost certainly imports. A third tin bronze, this axe, is at home in the Philia repertoire, and its copper is consistent with an ore body in the Limassol forest region in southern Cyprus. Tin bronze is also attested in 4 Philia spiral earrings from Sotira, a site also in the south. This dagger is of copper with lead isotope composition consistent with Ugani Marden. Typologically, it could either be a local product or an import. A perforated axe contains copper, which is marginally consistent with an origin on Kythnos in the Cyclades, as does this roughly cast ring. We have 5 of these rings, all certainly or probably from Philia. They were originally identified as armbands, but they're too small to have been worn by anyone other than a child, and this seems doubtful given their weight, which in the case of the analysed one is 444 grams. We have suggested that they were media of exchange, ring ingots in other words, their size, weight and shape being well suited to distribution. We've also suggested that perforated axes may have circulated as blanks or ingots with the hole used to string them together for transportation. Some of the rings may have reached Cyprus from elsewhere, as suggested by the lead isotope data for the analysed example, and the fact that it contains 1.4% lead, which is not consistent with the geochemistry of Cypriot ores. The discovery, however, of the Philia mould at Marquis leaves no doubt that axe-shaped examples were produced in Cyprus. The second perforated axe, which was not analysed, interestingly has a sign on it, as does another Philia example in the Cyprus Museum, as in fact exactly the same sign. And similar axes in the Soli hoard indicate their distribution also in coastal Silicia. So we have tin bronze imports, tin bronzes of local types made with local copper and imported tin, or reworked from imported artifacts, objects made of locally or imported copper, objects made locally of Cypriot copper, and what may be ingots which reached Cyprus perhaps from the Cyclades in the case of the rings, and were made locally in the case of the perforated axes. An outward movement of Cypriot copper also seems likely, but remains unproven. The suggested use of copper from the Limassol forest is also important if supported by further analyses. It would indicate that Vasilia's network extended not just to the ore bodies in the northern Troodos at Skoriotissa, Mathiatis, and so on, but also to the polymetallic high arsenic ore bodies that are found only in the Limassol forest area. The objects offered for sale in 1959 can be compared with 9 metal artifacts found under the plaster lining of the Dromos of Tomb 1 at Philia. Both groups suggest that some people at Philia were accumulating, distributing and recycling metal, and that the stock in trade of these merchants or traders included imported and locally produced artifacts of copper from Anatolia, Cyprus, and possibly the Cyclades. Other Philia imports include 2 gold or electrum spiral earrings from Sotira and 2 from Vasilia, which have good parallels in EB2 tarsus. The handful of toggle pins from Vasilia are, in my view, also likely to be imports. The toggle pins are not otherwise part of the Cypriot repertoire until well into the Middle Bronze Age, as are several gypsum vessels from Vasilia, probably ultimately from Egypt, according to Robert Merriles. So Vasilia was involved in a maritime trade during the Philia EC and acquiring copper from local ore bodies. So if people didn't move from Anatolia to Cyprus for copper, they certainly appear to have put in place some kind of system which involved the foundation of settlements like Marquis near ore bodies and allowed Vasilia to play a role in international networks and quite possibly to supply them with Cypriot copper. So returning to the issue of origin, we initially argued for a move to Cyprus from southwest Anatolia. I would now suggest that connections are more likely to have been with Silicia, not only because we can point to parallels in material culture, and I have done that during the course of this talk on a number of occasions, but because there is evidence for prior and ongoing contact between Cyprus and Tarsus in EB2 at a time when, to quote Mellink, Tarsus might have looked to Cyprus to bolster its copper supplies. Early EB2 deposits excavated at Tarsus by Goldman produced several sherds of Cypriot red-on-white ware. This is a Middle Chalcolithic fabric in the southwest, but Peltenberg suggests that it continued into the Late Chalcolithic in the north and reached Tarsus from this part of the island in the earlier 3rd millennium. In addition, a jug of red polished Philia ware was identified by Goldman in late EB2 Tarsus. I don't have a picture of that. And there are a number of sherds of Cypriot black slip and combed ware. Now, these are identified in many publications and in the Tarsus archive at Bryn Mawr as red and black streak burnished ware, but I don't think there is any doubt that they are what in Cyprus is known as Philia black slip and combed. And I show you some sherds here from Marquis with which you can compare them. There may also be other Philia material at Tarsus, such as this band burnished sherd. And again, I show you some parallels from Marquis and connections with cooking pots of type A from Marquis. And perhaps more red polished Philia ware, which in sherd form would not be easy to distinguish from local fabrics. And hot off the press, there is a possible Philia jug from EB2 Hachimusala Huyuk in the Elmela Plain, which has just been published in AJA by Ozgun and Unlu, and I thank them for allowing me to show these images. They suggest that this jug may have reached the site via an interior trade route from Silicia rather than through direct contact with Cyprus via the Lycian coast. The material from Tarsus certainly indicates contact between Cyprus and Silicia, both before and during the Philia, at a time when the north coast was active in the interregional metals trade and within the Anatolian EB2. Given the proximity, intervisibility, and ease of travel between Silicia and Cyprus, their involvement in a micro-regional interaction sphere in the EBA, as in later times, seems highly plausible. Silicia is located at the junction of Anatolia, Syro-Mesopotamia, and Cyprus, and so is also perhaps most logically where the mix of influences we see in the developed Philia may have come from. As Christine Eslick has recently pointed out, Silicia was also not a single entity. Tarsus has long been seen to represent the whole, but excavations at sites like Kinet Huyuk are beginning to show the heterogeneity of this region and how little we know about it. It's become increasingly clear also that we should not see the Philia as a sudden phenomenon, but as the culmination of an extended process of interaction. Edgar Peltenberg, Diane Bolger, and Lindy Crew point to offshore relations between Anatolia and Cyprus from the late 4th millennium through the first half of the 3rd millennium, primarily evident in the appearance in the Late Chalcolithic of new vessel forms, surface treatment and decoration, with parallels at sites like Karatash. These connections may have been primarily with Western Anatolia, but their direction, nature, and impact no doubt differed over time and between regions. They provide a background for the Philia move to Cyprus, one in which earlier interactions and information flows may have led to knowledge of the presence of copper in Cyprus. Now, there are many, many problems. The late Chalcolithic and Philia early Cypriot environments are for the most part evident only as before and after entities. What we have is an Anatolian-derived or even selectively Anatolianizing but distinct Cypriot signature for the Philia EC, already fully contextualized, already a product of adaptation, hybridization, negotiation, and so on. Nor do we fully understand the impact of time as a mediating factor, as Bakhuba has pointed out. The earliest stages of this process are likely to have taken place on the north coast, and we have no Philia settlement data from this region to throw light on initial arrival, establishment, and development. And the late Chalcolithic, in turn, is known almost entirely from the southwest. So we have a major regional information bias, and modeling fine-scale process across this disjunctive threshold is going to require a lot more data than we currently have. It's also important not to assume that the Philia looked the same all over the island. As Eddie Peltenberg has pointed out, it may be that we have a northwest Philia core with outliers in the south and west, rather than a single Philia entity. So now just to wind up, moving briefly beyond the Philia, sometime in the 23rd century, the Philia devolved into a number of regional entities. This is likely to have been, at least in part, a result of the collapse of international trade, perhaps associated with the adverse effects of the so-called 4.2K event. And it may have been felt most in the north of Cyprus, where investment in external relationships was greatest. We currently have very few imports from the rest of the early Bronze Age: a Syrian jug, a single gold object, and a pair of bronze toggle pins, all from Vounous. Cypriot material in Anatolia is similarly limited to a red polished 3 juglet from Kilisi Tepe in Western Silicia, and 2 red polished bowls from Yortan, and 1 probable example from Baba Koy. This suggests only very occasional contact between Cyprus and Anatolia in the last quarter of the 3rd millennium. This changed around 2000 BC, at much the same time as the Assyrian trading colonies were established at Kultepe and elsewhere. We now see a renewed flow of tin to the north coast, specifically to Lapithos, during the Middle Bronze Age, and a renewed outward flow of Cypriot copper, with references to copper from Alashia from at least 1900 BC at Mari, and lead isotope analysis suggesting Cypriot copper in the Aegean, also from the 19th century BC. My minimum estimate of the number of Middle Bronze Age imports on the north coast, primarily at Lapithos, is around 152. Pottery appears to have been only marginally involved, with a few Cypriot vessels found in Crete, some Kamaris ware vessels in Cyprus, and several from Syria or Cilicia. Most imports are of copper, bronze, lead, gold, silver, and faience, so it seems to have still been primarily a metals trade. Some of these objects may be from Anatolia, including this spherical-headed pin, and these loop-headed needles, which have close parallels at Tarsus, but the connections are wider now with the Aegean, likely including some of the gold work, and with the Levant, likely including high tin bronze toggle pins, which are virtually identical to examples from Syria, and presumably also either imports or imitations. Things changed again at the transition to the late Bronze Age in about 1650 BC, when the focus shifted from the north to the northwest, east, and south coasts, and we have an outflow of small pottery containers in Eastern Cypriot styles to Egypt, the Levant, Cilicia, and the Aegean, and imports of Syrian and Egyptian juglets, Canaanite jars, and an array of prestige goods, primarily to new coastal outlets like Enkumi. But the late Bronze Age is another story and one for someone else to tell. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for this amazing talk and really bringing all the all the data, whatever we know from Cyprus connected to Anatolia and vice versa together. I'm sure we are going to have interesting questions. I have many things on my mind already, but let's see our guests.